Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're focusing on something that's, well, it's invisible but absolutely central to modern medicine, ionizing radiation.
Yeah, it's everywhere in diagnostics. Think X-rays, CT scans.
Exactly. But for most of us, I think, the subject gets wrapped up in all this intimidating physics jargon,
Hmm.
words like Sievert, Gray, Compton scatter,
Hmm.
quality factor.
Yeah.
It just feels, well, inaccessible.
It really can seem that way. But understanding the basics is so important, not just for the healthcare professionals, but really for everyone, for you as a patient.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of paradox at the heart of it, isn't there?
There absolutely is. We're harnessing energy that's powerful enough to literally, change matter, potentially damage living cells.
But we rely on it every single day for diagnoses that can save lives.
Precisely. So our mission today really is to cut through some of that intimidating science. We want to define what ionizing energy actually is.
Look at how it interacts with our bodies, with human tissue.
Yeah, break down those confusing units they use to measure risk.
And maybe most importantly, explore the safety rules, the protocols that are in place to keep those risks as low as possible.
That's the goal. And maybe before we even get into the nitty-gritty physics, we should state the fundamental principle that guides everything.
The ethical foundation, really.
Exactly.
That's this. For any diagnostic study that uses ionizing radiation, the expected diagnostic benefit from that exam must clearly outweigh the potential biological risk from using that radiation. Simple as that. If there isn't a clear advantage, you just don't do the procedure.
That justification underpins everything else we're going to talk about. It's the starting point. Hashtag Eichtig, I, the nature and source of ionizing energy. Okay, so let's unpack that term, ionizing energy. We're not talking about like the warmth from a light bulb or radio waves. This is something different, something with enough punch to actually change things chemically. That's the key difference. At its core, ionizing radiation, whether it's a wave like an X-ray or a particle like an alpha particle, carries enough energy, enough oomph to physically knock an electron out of its orbit around an atom.
Okay, so you have a stable atom, right?
Yeah.
Balanced protons and electrons. And this radiation comes in and just ejects one of those electrons.
Precisely. It kicks it right out. And when an atom loses an electron, its electrical balance is gone. It becomes charged. It becomes an ion.
Hence ionizing radiation.
Exactly. That process, creating that electrically charged atom, or sometimes what we call an ion pair, that is the critical first step. That's the link to the biological effects we need to manage. Once you've altered that basic chemical structure, the cell starts to react. And that's where the potential for biological change begins.
Right. Now, it's interesting because we're actually exposed to this kind of energy all the time, aren't we? Even if we never set foot in a hospital.
Constantly, yeah. If you look at the total radiation dose an average person gets over a year, it comes from two main categories, or buckets, as we sometimes say.
Okay, what are they?
First, you've got natural sources. This is background radiation that's just always been here. It includes cosmic rays from space, radiation from naturally radioactive elements in the ground, like uranium and thorium.
Like granite countertops sometimes?
Yeah, that kind of thing. And even radioactive elements inside our own bodies, like potassium-40. Plus, a big chunk of natural background comes from radon gas seeping out of the ground.
Okay, so that's the natural stuff. What's the other bucket?
That's man-made sources. And this is where it gets interesting, maybe surprising for some people.
What's the single biggest contributor here? I think a lot of people might guess nuclear power plants or maybe fallout from old weapons testing.
That's a really common thought, but it's actually incorrect. By far, the largest portion of man-made radiation exposure for the average person comes from medical and dental X-ray exams.
Really, just routine checkups and scans.
Primarily, yes. And it's worth noting that the overall background dose, including man-made, has actually been creeping up in recent decades. Not because the Earth suddenly got more radioactive.
But because we're using medical imaging more.
Exactly. Especially more advanced imaging like CT scans and complex procedures like interventional radiology. We're just getting better at diagnosing things, and these tools are incredibly powerful, but they often involve radiation.
Which brings us right back to that benefit versus risk calculation and the responsibility of the professionals using this tech.
Absolutely.
So let's look inside the machine itself, that big X-ray tube you see hanging over the table. How does it actually generate that beam of X-rays? It's not like flipping a switch for a light bulb.
No, it's a bit more involved. It happens inside a special kind of vacuum tube, basically a glass bulb with all the air sucked out. And you need three key things happening together to make X-rays.
Okay, number one, You need the bullets, right? The electrons.
That's right. You need a source of electrons. This is usually a tiny wire filament called the cathode filament. We heat it up, much like an old light bulb filament, until it gets so hot it starts boiling off electrons. It's called thermionic emission.
And how do you control how many electrons boil off?
That's controlled by the current we send through the filament, measured in milliamperage, or MA. So more MA means a hotter filament, which means more electrons boil off per second. This directly controls the quantity or amount of X-rays we end up producing.
Okay, so MA is about how many. What's the second ingredient? You need to get those electrons moving like really fast.
Incredibly fast. To do that, we create a huge electrical voltage difference between this negative cathode filament and a positive target called the anode on the other side of the vacuum tube. This voltage difference acts like a powerful magnet, pulling the electrons across the gap at tremendous speed.
And that voltage is measured how?
We measure it using kilovoltage peak, or kVp. The kVp controls the speed and therefore the energy of those electrons when they hit the target. Higher kVp means faster electrons, which means the X-rays produced will be more energetic and more penetrating. We call this the quality of the beam.
So MA controls the number of X-rays, kVp controls their punch, their energy. Got it.
Exactly. And the third crucial step is, well, stopping them.
Deceleration.
Rapid deceleration. Those high-speed electrons slam into the anode target, which is typically made of a dense metal like tungsten. That abrupt stop is what converts their kinetic energy, their energy of motion, into X-ray photons.
And because they don't all stop in exactly the same way, the beam isn't uniform.
Correct. The resulting X-ray beam is what we call heterogeneous. It contains a whole spectrum of different energies, not just one single energy level. We usually measure these energies in units called kilo-electron volts, or KIF.
Okay, so now we've got this mixed energy, heterogeneous primary beam shooting out of the tube, heading towards the patient. This is where the physics starts to really matter biologically. When those X-ray photons hit the body, what can happen? What are the basic options?
Right, so when that primary beam hits matter, the patient's tissues, each individual photon basically has three possible fates.
Option number one.
It can be completely absorbed by the tissue, it hits something, stops, and deposits all its energy right there.
Okay. Option two.
It can just pass straight through the patient without interacting at all. No energy loss, just goes right through. These photons are the ones that reach the detector or film and create the darker parts of an X-ray image.
And option three. This sounds like the complicated one.
Option 3 is scattering. The photon interacts with an atom in the tissue, loses some of its energy, and then changes direction, bouncing off somewhere else. It doesn't get absorbed completely, and it doesn't pass straight through.
And it's really the absorption and the scattering that we need to understand, isn't it? Because those are the interactions that determine how the image looks, how much dose the patient gets, and how much exposure the staff might receive. Precisely. The source material talks about 5 main ways photons can interact, but for diagnostic radiology, we really focus on 3 key ones. Let's start with the simplest one, maybe, classic coherent scattering. Okay, what's that?
Coherent scattering, sometimes called Rayleigh scattering, really only happens with very, very low energy X-rays, typically below 10 Ke. Often these low energies are actually filtered out by the X-ray cube housing before they even reach the patient.
So maybe not super relevant for the final image or dose?
Not really. What happens is the low-energy photon interacts with the entire atom, sort of, as a whole. It makes the atom vibrate or get excited for a tiny fraction of a second. Then the atom immediately releases a new X-ray photon that has the exact same energy as the one that came in, but it's traveling in a slightly different direction.
So same energy, just a little nudge sideways, pretty much. And the crucial point here is no ionization occurs. The atom isn't changed chemically, and no energy is actually transferred or absorbed by the patient's tissues. So from a diagnostic perspective, coherent scattering doesn't really contribute to the image, and it doesn't contribute to the patient's dose in any significant way. It's more of a physical curiosity at these energies. Okay, let's move on to the interaction that is critical, the one that actually makes the picture but also delivers the dose, the photoelectric effect.
Yes, the photoelectric effect, or PE absorption. This is absolutely central to diagnostic imaging. It happens when an incoming X-ray photon, which needs to have enough energy to be in the diagnostic range, collides with one of the electrons that's tightly bound in an inner shell of an atom like the K or L shell.
Inner shell. Okay, what happens then?
Because that inner shell electron is held so tightly by the atom's nucleus, the incoming photon has to give up all of its energy to knock it out. The photon is completely absorbed in that collision.
Gone. Vanished.
Completely absorbed. And the electron it hit gets ejected from the atom. We call that ejected electron a photoelectron.
And because the atom just lost an electron.
It's now ionized. An ion pair has been created, the positively charged atom and the free negative photoelectron. And crucially, all the energy from that original incoming photon gets deposited right there, locally, within that tiny volume of tissue where the interaction happened.
So this is a major source of the dose the patient receives. It's the primary mechanism responsible for the patient's absorbed dose in diagnostic X-rays. But here's the flip side, the reason we rely on it. The chance, the probability of the photoelectric effect happening depends very strongly on the atomic number, the Z number of the atom it hits.
Meaning materials with a high atomic number like calcium in bone, Z20, or contrast agents like iodine, Z53, or barium, Z56, are much, much more likely to absorb X-rays via the photoelectric effect compared to materials with low atomic numbers like hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen found in soft tissues, average Z around 7.4. So that's why bones look white on an X-ray. They're absorbing way more photons photoelectrically than the surrounding muscle or fat.
Exactly. That difference in absorption creates the contrast, the different shades of gray that allow us to distinguish different structures.
Right.
The photoelectric effect is the main reason we get good subject contrast in our images. It's the image maker. Without it, X-rays would just be fuzzy shadows.
But the price for that beautiful contrast is the dose deposited in the patient.
That's the fundamental trade-off. You need PE for the image, but it delivers the dose. Okay, that brings us to interaction number 3, Compton scattering. You said this one is different, and it's more of a problem for the people working in the room. Yes, Compton scattering is a major concern for occupational exposure. It also happens within the typical diagnostic energy range, but the mechanics are quite different from the photoelectric effect.
How so?
Instead of hitting a tightly bound inner shell electron, the incoming photon interacts with the loosely bound outer shell electron of an atom in the patient's tissue. Outer shell. Looser. Okay, so what happens to the photon this time? Does it get absorbed?
No, it doesn't get fully absorbed. It only transfers part of its energy to that outer shell electron, just enough energy to knock it free from the atom. That ejected electron is called a Compton electron or recoil electron.
So an ion pair is still created, right? The atom is still ionized.
Yes, ionization still occurs. But the original photon isn't gone. Having lost some energy, it now changes direction and scatters off randomly. It could go sideways, forwards at an angle, or even scatter backwards towards the X-ray source. Okay, let's contrast that. Photoelectric effect. Photon hits inner electron, gets completely absorbed, deposits all energy locally, creates image contrast. Compton scatter. Photon hits outer electron, gives up some energy, creates some ion pair. But the photon itself survives with less energy and flies off in a random direction. That's a perfect summary.
So why is this scattered lower energy photon such a big deal for the technologist or the doctor in the room? They're not standing in the main beam.
Exactly. The occupational worker is typically standing off to the side, hopefully behind shielding. The radiation they are exposed to isn't the primary beam coming from the tube. It's almost entirely this secondary scatter radiation that's generated inside the patient by the Compton effect.
And because it scatters randomly.
It goes in all directions. It bounces off the patient, the table, the walls, the equipment. It essentially fills the room with low-level radiation coming from everywhere. This is the primary source of dose for anyone who has to be in the room during an exposure, especially during fluoroscopy or mobile X-rays where staff might be closer to the patient.
It's really interesting how those two interactions dominate different aspects. PE for patient dose and image, Compton for worker dose and, well, image fog too, right? Scatter degrades the image.
It absolutely does. That random scatter hitting the image receptor adds a layer of unwanted grayness or fog, reducing the contrast we work so hard to get with the photoelectric effect. That's why we use grids and collimation to try and minimize how much scatter reaches the detector.
Does the energy level of that scattered photon matter for protection? Is it easier or harder to shield against?
It matters a lot. Compton scatter photons, by definition, have lower energy than the original primary beam photons because they gave some energy away to eject that electron. This lower energy actually makes them easier to stop with shielding materials like lead.
So the lead apron is pretty effective against scatter.
Very effective against typical scatter energies, yes. That's why we wear them. However, there's a catch. If the initial X-ray technique uses a very high KVP, meaning the primary beam photons start with very high energy, then the Compton scatter they produce will also be relatively higher in energy even after losing some.
Making it a bit harder for the lead to stop it completely.
Exactly. Higher energy scatter is more penetrating, so there's always this balance in technique selection. Higher KDP can reduce patient dose sometimes by increasing penetration, but it can also increase the relative amount of scatter and make that scatter slightly harder to shield against for the worker. It's a constant optimization process.
Okay, we've got the physics of interaction down, but talking about how much radiation, the risk, the language gets tricky. The units of measurement seem notoriously confusing, partly because things have changed over time.
They really have. We're sort of caught between the older traditional units that were used for decades and the modern SI system, that's the System International Unité, which was officially adopted internationally around 1985.
But you still see the old units around, right?
Yeah.
In older texts or maybe on older equipment?
You do. So realistically, professionals in the field need to be comfortable with both sets of units and how to convert between them. It helps to think about what is being measured. There are basically 4 different concepts we need units for. Okay, concept 1, measuring the radiation just out in the air before it even hits anything, the potential exposure.
Okay.
The traditional unit for this was the Röntgen, abbreviated R. The Röntgen specifically measured the amount of electrical charge the ionization produced in a specific volume or mass of air.
And the modern SI equivalent, it's expressed directly in terms of charge per mass. Coulombs per kilogram, CKG. There's a specific conversion factor, $2.58 times 10 coulombs per kilogram equals 1 Röntgen. But honestly, a more practical and increasingly common term you'll hear for measuring this energy transfer to air is air kerma. Air kerma. What does kerma stand for?
It stands for kinetic energy released in matter, or sometimes in material. So air kerma measures the energy transferred from the radiation beam to the air.
Why is that useful?
It's a really good way to quantify the intensity of the beam itself coming out of the tube before it interacts with the patient. It's measured in units of energy per mass, specifically joules per kilogram, JKG. And 1 joule per kilogram has its own special SI name,
HS.
the gray, GI. So air kerma is often expressed in gray, or more commonly for diagnostic levels, milligray, MGI. It's used a lot for calibrating equipment output and setting a baseline for patient dose calculations.
Okay, so that's exposure in air. Now let's follow the beam into the patient's body. We need a unit for the energy that's actually deposited in the tissues, the absorbed dose.
Exactly. This is about the energy that stays behind. The traditional unit here was the RAD.
RAD, what did that stand for? Radiation absorbed dose. It had a specific definition. 100 ergs of energy absorbed per 1 gram of tissue or material. Sounds a bit old-fashioned. What's the SI unit?
The SI unit for absorbed dose is the gray, the same unit name we just mentioned for air kerma, because both represent energy per mass, JKG.
Okay, so gray is the modern unit for absorbed dose. How does it relate to the old rad? The conversion is nice and simple for this one. 1 gray equals exactly 100 rad. So 1 centigray, CDGAG, is equal to 1 rad. And the gray just measures the physical energy deposited, right? It doesn't care what kind of radiation it was or what tissue it hit.
Correct. The gray is purely a physical measure of energy concentration. If you absorb 1 gray from X-rays and I absorb 1 gray from, say, alpha particles, we've both absorbed the exact same amount of energy per kilogram of tissue.
But, and this seems like a really big but, we know different types of radiation can cause different amounts of biological damage, even if they deposit the same amount of energy.
Precisely. This is where it gets more complex, but also more clinically relevant. Absorbing 1 gray of alpha particles does far more biological damage than absorbing 1 gray of X-rays.
So we need a unit that accounts for that biological impact, not just the raw energy.
Exactly. We need a unit for what's called effective dose, or more technically, dose equivalent. This unit tries to put different types of radiation on an equal footing in terms of their potential harm to human tissue.
Okay, traditional unit first.
The traditional unit was the REM.
Right.
It stands for Radiation Equivalent Man, or sometimes Röntgen Equivalent Man.
And the modern SI unit.
The Seivert, SV, named after Rolf Sievert, a pioneer in radiation physics and protection. The Seivert is the crucial unit when we talk about radiation risk and setting safety limits for people.
So how do you get from the absorbed dose in gray, the energy, to the effective dose in Seiverts, the biological impact?
You use a conversion factor, or more accurately, a weighting factor. It used to be called the quality factor, QF, and now it's often incorporated into more complex radiation weighting factors, WR, but the principle is the same. You multiply the absorbed dose in gray by this factor to get the effective dose in Seiverts.
Dose, G, times quality factor equals effective dose, SV.
Basically, yes. Dose equivalent SV, absorbed dose GXQF. This quality factor accounts for how biologically damaging different types of radiation are.
Can you give an example, like comparing X-rays to something else?
Sure. For X-rays, gamma rays, and beta particles, the types most common in medical imaging, the quality factor is assigned a value of 1.
So for X-rays, 1 gray of absorbed dose equals 1 sievert of effective dose.
Exactly. For these types of radiation, the Gray and Sievert values are numerically the same. 1G equals 1 SV simple.
But what if you're dealing with something like neutrons, maybe from a research reactor or certain therapy machines?
Then it changes significantly. Neutrons are much more densely ionizing. They create a lot more damage along their path through tissue compared to X-rays depositing the same total energy. So neutrons are assigned a higher quality factor. Depending on their energy, the QF for neutrons can be 10 or even 20 in some cases.
So if you absorbed 1 gray of neutron energy,
That would translate to an effective dose of 10 sieverts if QF 10 times the biological impact compared to 1 gray of X-rays. Alpha particles are even higher with a QF of 20.
wow, that really highlights why we need the sievert for protection purposes. What's the conversion between sieverts and the old REM? Similar to gray and rad, 1 sievert equals 100 REM. So those occupational dose limits we'll talk about are often expressed in millisieverts, MSV, or millirem, REM. Okay, one last measurement type. This one's mainly for radioactive materials themselves, like in nuclear medicine, measuring how active the source is.
Right, this is measuring the rate of radioactive decay, how many atoms are disintegrating per second in a sample. The traditional unit was the Curie, CO, named after Marie Curie, of course.
And Curie was large.
Incredibly large in terms of disintegrations. 1 Curie was defined as $3.07 times 10 disintegrations per second, DPS. That's 37 billion atoms decaying every second. It was based on the activity of 1 gram of radium.
Okay, what's the simpler SI unit?
Much simpler. The SI unit for activity is the becquerel, BQ, named after Henri Becquerel, who discovered radioactivity. 1 becquerel is defined as exactly 1 disintegration per second, 1 BPS.
Much more manageable number, so the conversion is huge.
It is. 1 Curie equals 37 billion becquerels, or 37 gigabecquerels, GBQ. You use becquerels, or commonly megabecquerels, MBQ, to specify the dose of a radioactive tracer given to a patient for a nuclear medicine scan, or the strength of a therapy source.
So we've got the units sorted, measuring things in grays and sieverts. Now let's zoom right in. What actually happens at the cellular level? Why is the living cell vulnerable to this ionizing energy? What's the target? Well, the first thing to remember about the cell is its composition. It's mostly water, about 80%. The rest is made up of vital macromolecules, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and critically, the nucleic acids DNA and RNA. And the DNA, the genetic blueprint, is mostly inside the nucleus, right? Primarily, yes. And that DNA within the nucleus is considered the most critical and sensitive target for radiation damage. We broadly classify human cells into 2 types: somatic cells, which are all the regular body cells, skin, muscle, nerve, etc., and genetic or germ cells, sperm and ova, which pass on hereditary information. Damage to either can be problematic, but damage to germ cells has implications for future generations. Okay, so when radiation hits a cell, how does it actually cause damage? You mentioned direct hits and indirect hits.
That's right. There are 2 main theories or mechanisms. The direct hit theory is pretty much what it sounds like. An incoming photon or particle scores a direct hit on a crucial molecule, like a strand of DNA or a chromosome.
Like a tiny bullet hitting the target.
Essentially, yes. This direct impact can break the chemical bonds within that molecule, maybe causing a break in the DNA strand or damaging the structure in a way that stops it from functioning properly. This can lead to cell death or mutations if the damage isn't repaired correctly.
But you said the cell is 80% water. So is hitting the DNA directly the most common thing?
Actually, no. Especially with the types of radiation we use in diagnostics, like X-rays and gamma rays, which are sparsely ionizing, the indirect hit theory is far more likely.
How does that work?
Because the cell is mostly water, the radiation is much more likely to hit a water molecule, to a first. When ionizing radiation hits water, it causes a process called radiolysis. It breaks the water molecule apart.
Into what?
Into ions, and significantly, into highly reactive fragments called free radicals. Things like the hydroxyl radical are prime examples. A free radical is an atom or molecule that has an unpaired electron in its outer shell, which makes it extremely unstable and chemically reactive.
So the radiation turns the water inside the cell into, like, chemical attackers.
That's a great way to put it. These free radicals are short-lived but highly toxic. They diffuse through the cell water very quickly and can then chemically attack those critical target molecules, like DNA, even though the DNA itself wasn't directly hit by the initial irradiation.
Wow. So the damage is done chemically by these intermediaries created from water.
Exactly. It's like the radiation throws a chemical hand grenade into the cell, and the shrapnel, the free radicals, does the damage to the important structures. Because water is so abundant, this indirect action is the dominant mechanism for X-ray and gamma ray damage.
That makes sense. Now, not all cells in the body react the same way to radiation, do they? Some are much more sensitive than others.
Absolutely not. There's a huge variation in radiosensitivity. This was first described systematically way back in 1906 by two French scientists, Bergoni and Trébondeau.
The law of Bergoni and Trébondeau, what's the core idea?
Their law basically states that a cell's sensitivity to radiation damage is directly related to its reproductive activity, how often it divides, mitosis, and inversely related to its degree of differentiation or specialization.
Okay, break that down. What does it mean in simple terms? It boils down to this. Cells that are actively dividing, cells that have a high rate of mitosis, and cells that are relatively undifferentiated, not yet fully specialized, are the most sensitive to radiation. Conversely, cells that divide slowly or not at all and are highly specialized in their function are the most resistant. So based on that, what are some of the most radiosensitive tissues or cell populations in the human body?
Think about cells that reproduce rapidly. Top of the list would be lymphocytes, a type of white blood cell, erythroblasts, the precursors to red blood cells found in bone marrow, spermatogonia, the stem cells for sperm production in the testes, intestinal crypt cells lining the gut, and basal cells of the epidermis skin.
And critically, a developing embryo or fetus.
Absolutely critical. A fetus consists almost entirely of rapidly dividing, undifferentiated cells. This makes it extraordinarily sensitive to radiation, especially during the early stages of development. That's why protecting the unborn child from radiation exposure is a paramount concern in radiology.
Okay, on the flip side, what are some examples of radioresistant cells, the tough ones?
These are typically mature, highly specialized cells that don't divide much, if at all. Good examples are nerve cells, neurons, muscle cells, and mature red blood cells, erythrocytes. They can still be damaged by very high doses, of course, but they tolerate diagnostic levels of radiation much better than, say, bone marrow cells.
So this law explains why, for example, the lens of the eye or the thyroid gland are considered sensitive organs, and why shielding the gonads is so important, especially in younger people.
Precisely. It guides our understanding of which tissues are most at risk and where protective measures are most critical.
Now, when a cell is irradiated and damaged, what can happen to it? What are the possible outcomes?
There's a spectrum of possibilities. If the damage is minor, the cell might just experience a temporary delay in its division cycle delayed mitosis, or its rate of division might be altered if the damage is more severe.
Cell death.
Cell death is a definite possibility. This can happen immediately if the damage is overwhelming, or it might be delayed. The cell might die the next time it tries to divide, mitotic death. This cell-killing effect is actually what we harness purposefully in radiation therapy to destroy cancer cells.
But cells aren't completely helpless, are they? They have ways to fight back.
They absolutely do. This is a really crucial point. Cells have evolved sophisticated enzymatic repair mechanisms to fix damage, especially damage to DNA. Most sublethal damage that doesn't immediately kill the cell can be repaired.
So there's a chance for recovery.
A very good chance, especially at the lower doses typical of diagnostic imaging. Our bodies are constantly repairing DNA damage from various sources, including background radiation. We rely heavily on this repair capacity.
What's the risk then, if repair is possible?
The risk lies in incomplete or misrepaired damage. If the repair mechanisms make a mistake, or if the damage is too complex to fix perfectly, it can lead to a permanent change, a mutation in the DNA sequence, or a structural change in a chromosome. These unrepaired or misrepaired changes are thought to be the basis for the long-term, late effects of radiation, such as the potential, albeit small, increased risk of developing cancer years or decades later.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, shifting from individual cells to the whole organism, we sometimes hear about catastrophic effects like acute radiation syndrome, ARS. This isn't something you get from a chest x-ray, right?
Oh, absolutely not. ARS is a completely different beast. It's what's known as an early deterministic effect, meaning it only happens if a threshold dose is exceeded, and the severity increases with the dose above that threshold. And that threshold is huge.
How huge?
We're talking about receiving a massive dose of radiation, typically several gray, hundreds of rad, or more to the entire body, or a large portion of it, delivered over a very short period, minutes to hours. Think scenarios like nuclear accidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, or the atomic bombings, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The doses involved are thousands of times higher than any diagnostic procedure.
So completely different scale. What does ARS look like clinically?
It typically progresses through distinct stages. First is the prodromal stage, which occurs within hours to days of the exposure. Symptoms are usually nonspecific, like nausea, vomiting, fatigue, maybe some diarrhea. It's the body's initial reaction.
Then what?
Then comes the latent stage. The person might actually feel better for a while, maybe days or even weeks, depending on the dose. But during this time, underlying damage is accumulating in critical organ systems, particularly the ones with rapidly dividing cells we talked about earlier.
And after the latent period?
The manifest illness stage begins. This is when the full clinical picture emerges, reflecting the failure of the most damaged organ systems. Depending on the total dose received, ARS presents as one of three main syndromes.
Okay.
At doses above about 1-2 gray, you see the hematopoietic or bone marrow syndrome, dominated by the destruction of blood-forming cells, leading to infection, hemorrhage, and anemia. At higher doses, around 6-10 gray, the gastrointestinal syndrome appears, caused by the destruction of the gut lining, leading to severe diarrhea, dehydration, and electrolyte imbalance. And at extremely high doses, above, say, 50 gray, you get the central nervous system or cerebrovascular syndrome, which involves neurological symptoms like seizures, coma, and is rapidly fatal.
It's sobering stuff, but it really puts the relatively tiny doses used in medical imaging into perspective.
It absolutely does. Understanding ARS helps reinforce just how far removed diagnostic radiation levels are from causing these kinds of immediate, severe, whole-body effects. #V protection and monitoring standards.
Okay, so we understand the risks, from cellular damage to the extreme case of ARS. This naturally leads us to, how do we protect ourselves? What are the standards? And the single most important guiding principle seems to be ALARA. ALARA. Yes, it's more than just a guideline. It's really the fundamental philosophy of radiation protection. It stands for as low as reasonably achievable.
Reasonably achievable, but what does that mean in practice?
It means you don't just aim to stay below the legal dose limits. You have a professional and ethical obligation to use the minimum amount of radiation necessary to obtain the required diagnostic information. If there's a way to lower the dose, maybe by adjusting technique, using better shielding, increasing distance, and still get a diagnostically adequate image, you're expected to do it.
So it's a continuous optimization process. Exactly. It's dynamic. And it involves balancing image quality needs with dose reduction. There are regulatory bodies, like the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, in the U.S., that set standards for equipment performance and safety features to help facilities implement ALARA.
But ALARA is a principle. There must be hard numbers too, actual legal limits. Where do those come from?
They primarily come from recommendations made by scientific bodies like the International Commission on Radiological Protection, ICRP, and in the U.S., the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, NCRP. NCRP Report 116 is a key document outlining dose limits. These recommendations are then typically adopted into regulations by government agencies.
Okay, let's get specific. For someone working with radiation, a radiographer, a radiologist, a nurse, and interventional parts, what is the mandatory annual limit for their whole body exposure?
The annual occupational effective dose limit for the whole body is 50 millisieverts, 50 millisV,
Which is equivalent to?
5 rem in the traditional units, 50
Yeah.
millisV per year.
Is there a limit over a whole career?
Yes, there's also a cumulative dose limit. It's designed to prevent excessive lifetime risk. The recommendation is that the cumulative effective dose should not exceed 10 millisV multiplied by the worker's age in years.
So for a 40-year-old worker, the cumulative limit would be 400 millisV or 40 rem.
Correct. It provides a lifetime cap, reinforcing the annual limit.
Now, what about people who aren't radiation workers? The general public, patients' families in waiting rooms, staff in adjacent offices. What's the limit for them?
The dose limit for the general public for non-medical infrequent exposure is significantly lower. It's set at 1 millisV, 0.1 rem or 100 millirem per year from licensed operations. Some older guidelines mention 5 millisV, zero point 0.5 rem, but the 1 millisV limit for prolonged exposure is more common now and is effectively 1/50th of the annual occupational limit.
Why the big difference?
Several reasons. Occupational workers choose their profession, receive training in radiation safety, their exposure is monitored, and they derive a direct benefit, their job, from the exposure. The public exposure is usually involuntary, they receive no direct benefit, and they represent a wider range of ages and sensitivities. The lower limit reflects a more cautious approach for the general population.
Okay, those are the limits. How do we actually stay below them in the day-to-day practice? This brings us to the cardinal rules of radiation protection, the 3 pillars: time, distance, and shielding, often remembered by the acronym TDS. These are the practical tools everyone uses to implement ALARA. Let's take them one by one. First, time. How does minimizing time help?
It's pretty straightforward. The total dose you receive is directly proportional to the amount of time you spend in the radiation field. Less time, less dose. So for the patient,
For the patient, this means the technologist should use the shortest possible exposure time, controlled by the milliampere seconds or MA setting, that still produces a good image. Shorter exposure time also helps reduce image blur from patient motion. And for procedures like fluoroscopy, where the beam is on for longer.
time becomes even more critical. Techniques like pulsed fluoroscopy, where the beam turns on and off rapidly instead of being continuous, and last image hold significantly reduce the total beam on time. The operator must consciously minimize how long their foot is on the fluoro pedal. There's usually an audible timer that goes off after 5 minutes of beam on time as a reminder.
And for the occupational worker, how does time apply?
It means minimizing the amount of time they spend physically present in the room while radiation is being produced, especially during procedures with high scatter, like mobile radiography or fluoroscopy. If you don't need to be right next to the patient during the exposure, step out or step back. Okay, rule number 2. Distance. I've heard this called the most effective protection method, especially for the worker. Why is distance so powerful? Because of physics, specifically the inverse square law.
Oh, explain that.
The inverse square law states that the intensity of radiation from a point source decreases very rapidly as you move away from it. Specifically, the intensity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance.
Okay, what does that mean practically if I double my distance from the source?
You don't just cut your exposure in half, you cut it down to 1/4 of the original intensity, since 122 build 6 wells 14.2.
Wow. And if I triple the distance?
You reduce the exposure to 1/9. $1.32 pound Wool's 19-1. So even small increases in distance, especially when you're close to the source, make a huge difference in the dose rate.
So for the technologist dealing with scatter radiation coming from the patient.
Taking just 1 or 2 steps back from the patient during an exposure can dramatically reduce their dose. Maximizing distance is often the single easiest and most effective way for staff to protect themselves. That's why control booths have lead glass windows distance plus shielding, and why the cord on the mobile X-ray exposure switch is deliberately long to encourage the operator to stand back.
What about distance for the patient?
For the patient, distance is also important, but in a different way. We need to maintain a minimum source-to-image receptor distance, SID, typically at least 40 inches, 100 centimeters for general radiography, and often longer, like 72 inches or 180 centimeters for chest X-rays. Using a proper SID ensures the beam covers the area correctly and helps manage the patient's skin dose. Too short an SID unnecessarily increases the entrance skin exposure.
Okay, time, distance. The third cardinal rule is shielding, using physical barriers.
Right, placing absorbent material between the source of radiation and the person.
How does shielding apply to the patient first?
The most fundamental form of patient shielding is beam restriction, or collimation. The technologist must adjust the X-ray machine's collimators so that the beam only covers the specific area of anatomy that needs to be imaged.
Why is that so important?
2 reasons. First, it directly reduces the volume of the patient's tissue being irradiated, which lowers their overall dose. Second, irradiating less tissue means less Compton scatter is generated, which improves image quality and reduces the dose to any staff in the room. Good collimation is crucial.
What about specific shields, like lead aprons for patients?
We use specific area shielding, most commonly gonadal shielding, whenever the reproductive organs are near the primary beam, provided the shield doesn't obscure the anatomy of interest. This is especially important for children and adults of reproductive age, directly applying the law of Bergoni and Tribando. Flat contact shields, shadow shields, or shaped contact shields can be used.
And for the worker, what kind of shielding did they use?
Workers rely on both fixed and mobile structural shielding and personal shielding devices. Fixed shielding includes the lead lining in the walls of the X-ray room and the lead glass in the control booth window. Mobile shielding includes those portable lead barriers on wheels that can be moved around, often used during fluoroscopy or special procedures.
And the gear they wear.
Personal protective equipment, PPE, is essential. This primarily means lead aprons, which cover the torso, and usually separate thyroid shields or collars to protect the thyroid gland. Lead glasses or goggles can protect the lens of the eye, another sensitive area.
And we mentioned earlier, the light apron is particularly good at stopping that lower energy Compton scatter.
Exactly. A standard lead apron, usually with 0.5 millimeter lead equivalents in the front panels, offers very significant protection against the scatter radiation that constitutes most of a worker's dose. It's crucial to remember, though, that it provides very little protection against the high-energy primary beam. You should never rely on just an apron if you're in the path of the main beam. That's where distance and structural barriers come in. Makes sense. One final piece of the safety puzzle, actually measuring the dose workers receive.
Monitoring. Personnel monitoring, yes. This is how we track individual occupational exposures to ensure those dose limits, like the 50 millisV annual limit, aren't being exceeded, and to keep doses LRI.
Is everyone who works near radiation monitored?
Not necessarily. Monitoring is generally required for any worker who is likely to receive more than 1/10, 10% of the recommended annual dose limit. So if someone's likely to get more than 5 millisV 500 remo in a year, they typically need to be monitored.
And how is this monitoring done? What devices are used? There are several technologies, but three are most common. Probably the most widely used today is the optically stimulated luminescence dosimeter, or OSL.
OSL, how does that work?
It contains a special material, like aluminum oxide, that stores energy when exposed to radiation. Later in the lab, shining a laser light on it causes the material to release visible light, and the amount of light released is proportional to the radiation dose it received. They're very sensitive and can be reread multiple times.
What are the other types?
We also still see thermoluminescent dosimeters, or TLDs. They work on a similar principle but use heat instead of laser light to release the stored energy as light. They often come in chip or powder form inside the badge. And then there's the older pocket dosimeter, which looks like a pen and gives an immediate direct reading of exposure, but they're less common now for formal record keeping.
Okay, so you get your OSL or TLD badge. Where do you wear it? Does it matter? Oh, it matters hugely. The standard protocol is very specific.
Yep.
The primary dosimeter must be worn on the trunk of the body at collar level. Collar level.
Because that location provides an estimate of the dose to the head, neck, including the thyroid, and lenses of the eyes generally the highest dose areas for someone wearing a lead apron. And crucially, it must be worn outside the lead apron.
Outside. Why not underneath, where it's measuring the protected dose?
Because the dose limits apply to the effective dose received by the whole body. Wearing it outside gives a more conservative estimate of the maximum potential dose to the unprotected parts and allows for calculation of the effective dose. Measuring under the apron would significantly underestimate the actual exposure to sensitive areas like the eyes and thyroid.
Got it. Outside, collar level. Is there any exception to that? Yes, there's one very important exception. Pregnant radiation workers.
Ah, right. Protecting the fetus.
Exactly. When a worker declares her pregnancy, she is typically issued a second dosimeter. This second monitor is specifically designated as the fetal dosimeter, and this one is worn at waist level underneath the lead apron.
So it's measuring the dose that actually gets through the apron to the abdominal area. Precisely. This provides the best estimate of the dose being delivered to the highly sensitive fetus, allowing the facility to ensure that the separate, much lower fetal dose limit, typically recommended as 0.5 millisV per month and 5 millisV total for the gestation period, is not exceeded. It's a critical part of fetal protection. Hashtag outro. So if we try and pull all of this together, we started with the basic physics, how ionizing radiation knocks electrons out of atoms. We saw how that leads to biological effects, mainly through indirect action via water molecules in the cell.
And we broke down those units gray for absorbed energy, but Sievert for biological impact, using that quality factor.
Right, and we saw the crucial difference between the photoelectric effect, great for image contrast, main source of patient dose, and Compton scattering, which creates that troublesome scatter radiation, the main source of worker dose.
Which is why time, distance, and shielding are so vital for the staff. Distance being the superstar because of the inverse square law.
Absolutely. And all of it operates under that guiding principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, backed up by strict dose limits and careful monitoring.
It's a complex field, but the safety protocols, when followed, are very effective. The resilience of cells to repair damage, combined with these protective measures, really underpins the safety of modern medical imaging.
It does. The science can seem daunting, but the practical steps for protection are actually quite straightforward and powerful. Which brings us back full circle to that core idea. The benefit must outweigh the risk. And thinking about that, here's something to consider as we wrap up. Technology doesn't stand still, right? Definitely not.
We're seeing huge advances, particularly with things like artificial intelligence and machine learning being applied to medical imaging. One of the big goals there is often to create diagnostic quality images, using significantly less radiation dose than before, essentially, getting the same information with fewer photons.
That's a major area of research and development, yes. Noise reduction algorithms, image reconstruction techniques. So here's the final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. If these AI-driven technologies become truly widespread and effective, allowing us to get the necessary diagnostic benefit with dramatically lower radiation doses, could that fundamentally shift the reasonably achievable part of ALARA? Could we reach a point where the risk side of the equation drops so low that we might even see official dose limits, especially for occupational workers, being revised downwards in the future? How might technology continue to reshape this fundamental risk-benefit balance?
Something to think about. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us.